This is Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 52 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. Amiga AGA versus PC VGA. My good friend, John Shawler, you may know him as Boatofcar from the Amigos podcast. Boat is one half of the team. Boat is 1/3 of the team. Mentioned on Twitter the other day how AGA basically is hot stinking garbage. Here's his tweet right here. So you can see here he's saying that OCS, ECS games were as good as any AGA games, and that he continually says that AGA is the biggest disappointment in Amiga's history. Now, I don't disagree that Apidia is absolutely a gorgeous game, and that OCS and ECS games on the Amiga can look absolutely fantastic. Most of my favorite games fall into that realm simply because there aren't as many AGA games for reasons I'll explain in a little while. But I do disagree with John's opinion that AGA is the biggest disappointment in Amiga's history, because it's really a very powerful chipset. Not as good as it could have been, but very powerful, and I'm going to try and prove that right now. While I did do an episode a couple of months back that I'll link to in the description about the power of AGA graphics, and I had Pixel Vixen and Bill from Amiga Bill give me some pictures that we could display in some of the higher end AGA resolutions to show just how high quality it is. Today I'm going to focus more on what the AGA chipset can do and how it compares not only with the original VGA PC standard, but also things like SVGA that came out a few years later. Lastly, I'll do a comparison with 1992, 1993 prices of getting an Amiga system fairly well decked out, and comparing it with a 386SX system of the day that would be roughly comparable, and we'll see where the prices fall. Now, first off, let's define what VGA graphics actually are. Now, VGA as a connector is the little blue connector that goes on the back of still a lot of modern PCs, and that's something a little bit different. They've kind of usurped the name. VGA stands for Video Graphics Array, and it's a type of technology that IBM came out with in 1987 for displaying graphics. It superseded the previous CGA and EGA graphics. It has several standard modes. It's got 640 by 480 in 16 colors. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? It has 640 by 350 in 16 colors. That's to work with EGA type graphics, backwards compatibility. It has 320 by 200 modes in either 4 or 16 colors. And it has 320 by 200 modes in 256 colors. That's VGA graphics. The colors come from an 18-bit palette, so from a palette of 262,144 colors, which is a lot. I can only count to like 158,000 colors before I start losing track of where I'm at. VGA generally used a 256K of dedicated video RAM and ran at 31 kilohertz, which is great because then the image would be fairly rock solid. It did not support sprites, it had no blitter, but it was pretty fast, and it supported fast data transfers. It did support smooth hardware scrolling though. You could get some pretty nice looking images in the 320 by 200 mode, but not near photographic quality images, considering the low resolution of 320 by 200. Now let's compare that to AGA graphics, which really came out in late 1992. AGA stands for Advanced Graphics Architecture. It's fully 100% backwards compatible with older ECS or enhanced chipset and OCS, which is original chipset Amiga graphics modes. It supports planar graphics, PLANAR, which are bit plane graphics, a little different than the chunky ones VGA uses. AGA uses a 24-bit color palette, which is 16.8 million colors, a lot more than VGA. Here are the common display modes. All of these modes that I'm about to list work in either 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, or 256 colors. That's from 1-bit plane up to 8-bit planes. Every single mode supports it just fine. We can do 320 by 200, 320 by 400 interlaced. We can do 640 by 200, 640 by 400 interlaced, 1200 by 200, and 1200 by 400 interlaced. Now the Amiga normally puts out a 15 kilohertz signal to comply with NTSC standards, so it'll play beautifully on your television. But it was also absolutely 100% capable of putting out a solid 31 kilohertz VGA type signal for use on a regular VGA monitor. This could be used for rock-solid workbench displays. You can also enable overscan on an Amiga with no problems at all to get the screen image all the way up to the borders, to get resolutions like 720 by 480 or up to 1440 by 480 pixels. Overscan is fantastic when you're dealing with video graphics. Now you can already see that AGA supports much higher resolution graphics than VGA, and the color support in all modes is much higher than VGA could dream of. But this was just the beginning, as the Amiga can easily display any of these graphic modes in 256,144 colors on screen simultaneously in Ham 8 mode. And with all those colors, it was vastly superior to the old Ham 6 mode, 4,096 colors on screen, and had almost no fringing. When you display even a 640 by 480 picture on an Amiga in 256,000 colors, it blows away anything VGA could even dream of back in the day. Add to that the Amiga's special hardware scrolling, its blitter, and its ability to handle sprites, and it really leaves traditional VGA in the dust. So I think that we can agree that AGA is far superior to traditional VGA in almost every way. Almost every way. But that's not the end of the story. As VGA standards were improved on over time, in 1988, a group called VESA, Video Electronics Standard Association, came up with some new standards, including Super VGA or SVGA. The new 1989 standard allowed for 800 by 600 modes in 16 colors, and some of the lower resolutions, like 640 by 480, in 256 colors. A couple years after that, they introduced some modes like 1024 by 768 in 16 colors, and they even got as high as 1024 by 768 in 16-bit color before too long. So by the time AGA came out on the Amiga in late 1992, a lot of clone PCs were already using some of the SVGA technology. Some of them had moved away from traditional VGA, and some of the more expensive ones were starting to use some of the SVGA cards, which required a more expensive monitor, and we'll see that in the price comparison. So the new SVGA standard wins, hands down, right? Case closed, Amiga sucks, John wins. No, not quite. Because it turns out that Amiga AGA graphics are incredibly programmable, and you're not even for a second limited to the Amiga modes that are pre-programmed into Workbench. Before long, after AGA chipset machines came out, people created new monitor drivers to take advantage of these new modes that included, but are not limited to, 800 by 300 modes, 800 by 600 modes, 1024 by 768 modes, 1280 by 720 modes, and 1280 by 1024 pixel modes. And guess what? All of them, every single one, theoretically supports up to 262,000 colors on screen at one time. Sounds a little better than Super VGA, doesn't it? A little bit. So poo-poo to you, Super VGA. Well, to be honest, these modes came with a price. For one, the AGA Amigas only had 2 megabytes of chip memory, and things like 1024 by 768 images in 256 color or Ham 8 images, they use a lot of chip memory. Modes like 1280 by 1024 in Ham 8 mode barely work at all because it uses up almost every kilobyte of memory that you have. They're also quite slow on non-accelerated systems, dragging the computer to a crawl in some places. You try and set up a 1024 by 768 in 256 color Workbench, it's going to be slow. There is no denying that, and I won't deny that. But what these modes are good for is for productivity software. Nice, high-resolution displays available for your desktop publishing program, 1024 by 768 in 16 colors. Beautiful for high-resolution desktop publishing. For character generation, because Amiga was so strong in videos, a nice 1440 by 480 or even a higher resolution character-generated text is jaggy-free, and they work beautifully in 8, 16, 32 colors, so they're still nice and fast in those resolutions and color modes. But another curiosity about these special modes is their funky scan rates that they use. Normal Amigas, 15 kilohertz, VGA modes on the Amigas, 31 kilohertz, pretty standard. These special graphics modes, 800 by 600, 1024 by 768, would work in like 17 kilohertz or 22 kilohertz, modes that most monitors weren't smart enough to handle. Now, you get yourself a nice Commodore monitor like a 1492 or a 1960, it handles those modes all day long. And to be perfectly honest, the higher resolution modes on a PC, some of the really high res modes, you're gonna have to buy a high-end monitor for that too. So no matter what you do, when you're dealing with weird resolutions, you need an expensive monitor. These high resolution, high color modes can be pretty taxing on our poor little Amigas. And they can really get the Alice chip and the Lisa chip really very hot. It was common practice back in the day and even today to put a couple of heat sinks on Alice and maybe on Lisa in order to take advantage of these high resolution modes without overheating and causing weird effects like some screen tearing and some artifacting on the screens. You won't see that when you're dealing with high resolution, near photographic quality images, but like on Workbench and things like that, you can see some artifacts every now and again if the chips get too hot. So yes, AGA technically can handle superior resolutions to VGA, and it's an even match or in some ways superior to Super VGA. Now, SVGA and VGA certainly wins in the flicker fixture race, as many of these Amiga high-res modes still flicker, but you could also spend $100 and get a flicker fixer and solve most of those problems too. So how about cost of these machines back in late 92 to mid 1993? Now, you could certainly build a really nice PC back in the day with 1024 by 768 24-bit graphics that just blow the Amiga away, but you're going to pay for it back then. So let's see what we need to do just to match an Amiga 1200 back in the day. So let's start out by designing a nice little Amiga 1200 and a nice little 386 SX PC machine that's going to be similar to it. We'll start out with the Amiga. An Amiga 1200 with 2 megs of chip RAM and an 80 megabyte hard drive back in the day was about 770 American dollars. Add another 4 megabytes of expansion memory, trapdoor memory. Adding that kind of memory to your Amiga just about doubles, maybe a little more than doubles the performance of the entire Amiga. So let's do that. That's about $150. Now we're going to need a nice monitor to go along with it that supports not only the native Amiga modes, but some of these special Amiga modes I talked about. We'll go with a Commodore Amiga 1942. Pretty good monitor. $380 back in the day. Amiga total is about $1,300 so far. Now let's look at our PC. We're going to go with a Gateway. Everybody knows Gateway. They ended up owning Amiga for a while. We're going to go with a 386 SX 25 megahertz, a little bit faster than our Amiga 1200. 4 megabytes of RAM, 80 megabyte hard drive, SVGA video, so it'll handle 1024 by 768 in 16 colors, 800 by 600 and 256 colors. Pretty standard for the day, pretty common. It's going to include a pretty average 14-inch SVGA monitor. The whole system's about $1,500, $1,499. Now, you got to compete with the Amiga, like I said. And did this machine come with an audio card? No, it came with a little PC speaker that went blink, boop, 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 which sucked. It sucked back in 1981 when they came out with it. The VIC-20 sounded better than that speaker. So let's add a nice traditional Sound Blaster card. Nothing fancy, just the basic Sound Blaster card, another $100. So right now we're up to $1,600 for a PC. You can see the Amiga is about $300 less expensive, and it has a full multitasking operating system and an extra 2 megabytes of RAM that the PC doesn't have. But it would have made a pretty reasonable machine back in the early 90s. Is it superior to the Amiga 1200? Well, there's more productivity software available, but I think as far as the quality of the games in 1992, I think the Amiga still had a better selection of games. So who would have had the superior graphics? The Gateway can handle 800 by 600 in 256 colors, 1024 by 768 in 16 colors, but our Amiga can handle all of those same modes in 256,000 colors, plus all of the other advantages of Amiga graphics. Could you get a superior graphics card for your PC back in the day that put the Amiga's graphics to shame? Absolutely. You could drop as much money as you want to, get a nice 24-bit card. At that time, I don't think VESA Local Bus was a thing, but there were some high-end 32-bit slots you could buy on some expensive computers, and it would honestly beat the Amiga. So you figure you pay another $300 or $400 for an additional graphics card. New monitor, you're going to have a new monitor because the little 14-inch that comes with it's not going to handle it. Say $500 or $600 for a monitor. Now, why would you waste your money putting an expensive graphics card in a 386? No, you got to go with a 486. So let's upgrade her to a 486DX, and then all of a sudden you're talking about a $2,500 to $3,000 computer compared to the Amiga at $1,300 with a monitor. More than double the price. That's where the Amiga's advantage come in. And don't forget, you could also bypass that Amiga monitor and hook this thing up to your television, okay, or an existing monitor. And you didn't even have to spend the $380 on an Amiga monitor if you wanted to use most features of an Amiga. So to be honest, the gap between Amigas and PCs had closed quite a bit by 1992 or 1993. But the Amiga was still a fantastic value. So I think I've proven that the Amiga, for its price, had superior graphics to an affordably priced PC of that era. So why did game designers not spend more time writing really nice AGA games for the Amiga? I think there's a couple of reasons. For one, there were a lot more OCS and ECS machines out there, so they're going to write for the platform that they can sell the most copies on. And it was expensive to develop for two different architectures. The AGA system was also not out for that long. Late 1992 until Commodore went belly up in 1994. So we've only got a couple of years that they're getting used to programming and really taking advantage of the AGA graphics. PCs were also becoming quite popular for video game playing back in the day, in the early 90s to mid 90s, and a lot of the publishers were going where the money was, and that's just the honest to goodness truth. Now, from my personal perspective, I had used an Amiga, started with my Amiga 500 in 1988, and I used the Amiga, I got an Amiga 3000, I used that exclusively up until 1995 when I got my first PC. It was a year after Commodore went belly up, nobody knew what SCOM was going to do, and by that time I was in the industry selling PCs, so I ended up getting one for myself. But I was happy, even with my ECS graphics up until then. Now, it wasn't until 2001 or so that I actually bought an Amiga 1200. I got it from Amiga Kit back in the day, some new old stock. And that reminded me of why I used the Amiga back in the day and why I felt for years after the Amiga even financially failed, I felt it was a better platform. I will patiently wait for Boat's apology tweet and wait for him to admit that AGA Graphics are actually a fantastic platform that just was not properly taken advantage of by software developers. Let's see. No tweets yet. I'm waiting, Boat. Anytime, buddy. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode exploring the power of AGA. I'd like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Patreons who help me out by donating a little every month to making this channel better and better all the time. What better way to thank them than this nice AGA generated page of my Patreons? So please like and subscribe to my channel. Please leave a comment below. Tell me about your experience with Amiga graphics back in the day. Tell me about your experience when you switched from going from an Amiga to a PC, whether it was good or bad or whatnot. Let me know how it went for you. Follow me on Twitter at 10mark1. Take a look at my Patreon page. Happy to have new members. But until next time, this is Doug telling Boatofcar that the AGA graphics are really awesome. Now I'm signing out.